I didn't say a word when the man in a stiff polo shirt slid the eviction notice across my kitchen table. His cologne smelled like chemicals, his smile rehearsed. He probably thought he was doing me a favor, giving me 60 days to disappear from the land my grandfather had built with his own 2 hands. My land. I looked down at the neat black letters stamped across official paper. Vacate immediately. Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Their confidence bled through every line, like they believed ink and arrogance could erase generations. Instead of answering, reached into an old leather folder I kept beneath the table. The edges were frayed, corners soft from decades of handling. I slid a brittle piece of parchment across the table, the kind of document that still carried the faint must of history. The man frowned, then looked closer. His lips tightened. It was the original 1923 water rights deed, signed in fountain ink by my great-grandfather and notarized with the county seal. That deed wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a weapon older than their subdivision, older than their rules, older even than the city council that had sold me out. He shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. I could see it in his eyes he didn't understand the full weight of what he was looking at. But I did, because 35 luxury homes had just been built downstream from my grandfather's dam. And those homeowners had no idea that their dream community stood on land protected by the one force. No HOA could outvote federal water law. I leaned back in my chair, let the silence stretch, and whispered the thought burning inside me. They built their paradise on stolen ground, and now the water's coming back. Long before survey stakes and construction trucks scarred the horizon, this land was alive with simpler rhythms. My grandfather, everyone just called him Pops, bought the property back in 1955. Back then, Austin was still a sleepy college town, where barbecue smoke curled through the air and neighbors waved at each other on gravel roads. Pops wasn't rich, but he had something far more valuable: grit. He raised cattle on rolling hills, worked sunrise to sundown, and still had energy to take me fishing in the creek that cut across the back 40. He used to say, "Land is only as good as the care you give it." And Pops cared deeply. In 1978, during one of the worst droughts anyone could remember, Pops built the Little Earth Dam. Nothing fancy, just good engineering with some help from the Army Corps. He didn't do it for money or prestige. He did it so the cattle had water, so the neighbors downstream could survive the dry months, so the land itself would keep breathing. That dam was his way of giving back, of protecting something fragile yet powerful. Water. I remember standing beside him as a boy, my small hands gripping the rough wood of the spillway gate. He'd point to the trickle flowing into the creek. "That's life right there," he'd say, his voice carrying the weight of a lesson I was too young to understand. "One day you'll be the one to guard it." Decades later, I found myself far from home, serving overseas in Afghanistan. Funny thing about war zones, you learn fast how precious clean water really is. I spent years digging wells, managing flood control, building systems so villages could survive. Water wasn't just survival, it was power. And when people tried to steal it, they were willing to fight to the death. While I was gone, Pops passed away. The farmhouse grew quiet, his tools resting exactly where he'd left them. The land slipped into a trust managed by my sister Sarah. She lived in California, thousands of miles away. She didn't know Texas land law, didn't know that an HOA could twist adverse possession into a weapon. She just assumed the taxes were being handled, the land kept safe. But the world doesn't pause just because you're grieving. Developers sniffed opportunity. HOA sharks circled. They saw wide open fields, a quiet trust, and no one watching closely. And by the time I came home, boots crunching that same gravel driveway I'd run across as a kid, I wasn't met by green pastures and the sparkle of Pops's dam. I was met by concrete trucks, backhoes, and survey markers stabbing into the soil like enemy flags. The land Pops had tended, the water he had protected, the promise he had left me someone else, was already laying claim to it, and standing there. Fists clenched, I realized something. Pops had been right all along. One day I would have to guard it. That day had come. If Pops was the spirit of the land, then Maggie Thornwell was the storm that tried to poison it. She arrived in my life not with honesty or respect, but with a golf cart, a clipboard, and the kind of smile that made you check your pockets after she left. Maggie was the president of Willowbrook Estates HOA, 52 years old, a woman who wore tennis skirts like they were business suits, and a permanent layer of perfume meant to disguise the ever-present cigarette smoke that clung to her. She spoke in a syrupy drawl that almost sounded sweetened till you realized she was wrapping barbed wire in honey. Her husband, Rick, was no better. A city councilman with too much power and too few morals, he knew how to fast-track zoning changes with a flick of his pen. He was the kind of man who could smile into the camera while robbing you blind behind closed doors. Together, they were dangerous, an HOA queen and her politician king, united by greed. I first saw their empire the day I came home. Where Pops's rolling fields had stretched golden in the sun, 35 skeletal frames of dream homes now stood, their foundations poured right across my back 40. Concrete mixers churned. Crews hammered. Survey flags fluttered in the wind like an occupying army. I stormed up to the foreman, dust biting my tongue as I spoke. "You're on my land." He didn't even flinch. "Sorry, buddy. We've got permits. This is Willowbrook Estates now. Permits." My boots sank into the dirt. Pops had worked for decades, and all I could see were strangers carving it up like they owned it. Then came Maggie, rolling up in her shiny white BMW golf cart, oversized sunglasses perched on her nose. She looked me up and down like I was a stray dog that had wandered too close to her yard. "Your family abandoned this land." "Honey," she said, the word honey curdled with condescension, "we're just putting it to good use for the community."
Oh?
The community? I glanced at the half-built McMansions, the manicured tennis courts on stolen pasture, the iron gates that shut out everyone who didn't fit her picture-perfect suburb. Maggie wasn't building community. She was building control, and she wasn't done. Within weeks, I discovered her crews had rerouted the small creek that fed Pops's dam. Each day, the water level sank lower, the heart of the land draining away. That dam had been designed to serve farmers and families through droughts, to keep life flowing. Maggie was choking it, turning water into a private ornament for her new development. I confronted her again, fury shaking my voice. She just smiled wider, leaning close enough that her perfume and smoke mixed into something sour. "You should have stayed closer to home, soldier boy," she whispered. "This land doesn't belong to you anymore." That's when it hit me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't bad paperwork. It was war-polished, polite suburban war. They had city council seats, zoning maps, and HOA bylaws. But me? I had Pops's legacy, a soldier's resolve, the one thing they'd overlooked, the power of water waiting behind a dam. I walked away that day, fists clenched, dust rising with every step. Maggie thought she'd won. Rick thought his signatures had sealed my fate, but they hadn't counted on the truth buried in courthouse records. They hadn't counted on federal law, and they sure as hell hadn't counted on me. When you fight a war overseas, the enemy wears a uniform. Back home, the enemy wears a smile, carries a clipboard, and hides behind city ordinances. The first strike came from my so-called lawyer. I hired him in desperation, thinking I needed an expert to untangle the mess Maggie and Rick had spun. He quoted me at a $5,000 just to begin challenging the zoning change. $8 to $5 grand for the privilege of swimming upstream against a current Rick himself had redirected. I fired him on the spot. That's when I realized the courtroom wouldn't save me. The harassment started slow, like testing the fence for weak spots. A surprise inspection from the county building department. A citation for unsightly structures. Even though my farmhouse had stood solid since 1962. Noise complaints when I ran my radio while mending fences. Then it escalated. One morning I woke to a convoy of county vehicles lined up along my gravel driveway. Building inspector, fire marshal, health department, animal control. It was like a regulatory SWAT team had descended on my property. One found minor violations. A porch foundation suddenly unsafe. A septic system that had passed inspection 6 months ago now deemed hazardous. A livestock too close to a residential zone. The pattern was obvious. death by 1,000 citations. And then Maggie launched her propaganda campaign. Local news crews showed up to film her standing in front of a manicured lawn, eyes glistening as she talked about the dangerous dam threatening innocent families. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue at all the right moments, playing the role of community savior. Her performance was flawless, till you remembered the dam had passed every safety inspection for 45 years. But truth doesn't travel as fast as a lie, especially when it's dressed in pearls and broadcast at 6 o'clock. Next came the neighborhood forums. The Nextdoor app became her digital pulpit. She never mentioned my name directly, but she didn't have to. Aggressive property disputes, unstable individuals, troubled veteran. In a small community, everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. Even my sister Sarah called from California, voice trembling. "Jake, maybe it's not worth it. Maybe just take their money and walk away." I clenched my jaw. This wasn't about money. This was about Pops, about land, about water. It was also about something bigger. The idea that people like Maggie could twist laws, meant to protect communities into weapons of theft. Every night I stood on my porch, the smell of cedar pollen and diesel exhaust heavy in the air, watching their construction crews work double shifts. Every morning I counted new foundations, new roofs, new walls closing in. Every evening I measured the dam, watched the water line drop lower and lower. Maggie thought she had me cornered. It's buried in paperwork, smeared in the press. It's painted as a villain in my own hometown. But what she didn't know was that I had started documenting everything. Trail cameras hidden along the fence line. Time-stamped photos of every diverted stream. Flow measurements taken at dawn and dusk. If they wanted to drown me in bureaucracy, fine. But I was about to drown them in evidence. Because while Maggie fought with paper and politics, I had something stronger on my side, the truth, and a dam full of water waiting for its moment. For weeks, I felt like I was fighting shadows. Maggie and Rick pulled every bureaucratic string, and I was the puppet being jerked around. But one late night at the courthouse, surrounded by dust, bad coffee, and fluorescent lights, I found the thread that would unravel their whole scheme. Buried in a stack of yellowed manila folders were Pops' original dam permits. Dated 1978, my grandfather hadn't just thrown some dirt and concrete together. He'd worked directly with the Army Corps of Engineers to design that dam for flood control and watershed management. That meant one thing: federal jurisdiction. My heart pounded as I read the stamped signatures. Federal oversight trumped local zoning, city ordinances, and every HOA rule Maggie could dream up. They hadn't just picked the wrong farmer to mess with. They had picked a fight with federal law, and then came the real knockout, in another dusty drawer. One found a deed dated 1923, signed by my great-grandfather, senior water rights to the entire Willow Creek watershed. Older than the city itself, older than the county's water district, older than every shiny McMansion sitting on my land. That parchment was more than history. It was a legal nuclear weapon. Maggie and Rick hadn't just stolen dirt, they'd stolen water that was never theirs to touch. Still, I needed someone who could help me wield that weapon. That's when I called Tony Riggs, an old Army buddy who now worked in the EPA's Enforcement Division. I told him about the creek diversion, the construction, the dam permits. His voice on the line was steady, but I could hear the weight behind his words. "Jake, if they diverted a natural waterway without federal permits, that's a Clean Water Act violation. And if your dam falls under Corps' jurisdiction, they're in serious trouble." I leaned back in my chair, adrenaline buzzing like electricity under my skin. For the first time, the battlefield didn't feel hopeless. I wasn't just some stubborn veteran clinging to old dirt. I was standing on a fortress of federal law. That night, I laid out every photo, every flow measurement, every trail camera shot across my kitchen table. Diesel fumes still drifted through the open window from construction trucks rumbling in the dark, but for once, I didn't feel powerless. Maggie had her golf cart armies. Rick had his council votes. But I had Pops' dam, a deed older than their entire development, and a federal ally who was just as eager to see justice served. I whispered into the empty kitchen, the words rolling out like a promise. They thought they could drown me in paperwork, but this time, I'm the one holding the floodgate. The morning after I found Pops' permits, I woke to something worse than the rumble of concrete trucks. It was the sound of my phone buzzing non-stop. Texts, missed calls, news alerts. Maggie had taken her war to the public stage. There she was on the 6 o'clock news, standing in front of a row of freshly painted houses with 35 families watching behind her. Her voice quivered just enough to sound sincere as she spoke into the camera. "We're just concerned about our children's safety," she said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "That dam looks ready to burst, and there's a troubled veteran up there threatening our community." The words hit like shrapnel. Troubled veteran. She didn't have to say my name. In a small town, everybody knew exactly who she meant. By evening, her words had spread like wildfire. On Nextdoor, parents warned about unstable individuals. Hashtags popped up on Facebook. #ProtectOurKids. A petition circulated demanding the city condemn my property for public safety. The smear campaign worked. Old friends crossed the street to avoid me. Strangers drove by slow, staring like I was a headline waiting to happen. Even Sarah called from California, her voice heavy with fear. "Maybe you should just let it go. Sell. Start fresh." For a moment, I almost broke. The weight of isolation pressed down harder than any deployment ever had. Overseas, at least I'd had a unit. Here it felt like me against the whole town. But then, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Chen showed up at my door with a tray of dumplings. She'd farmed her family's garden downstream for 60 years, and since the creek had been diverted, her soil had cracked like desert sand. She placed her hand on mine and said, "I know what they're doing. You're not alone." 2 days later, Miguel Santos walked onto my porch. His family's farm had relied on Willow Creek since 1887. Now his fields were dust, his cattle thirsty. He handed me a folder thick with photographs and old records. "My grandfather fought to keep this land alive. I'll stand with you." Her support lit a spark. Maggie wasn't as invincible as she thought. The more I dug, the more stories surfaced. Families pressured, farms rezoned. Neighbors pushed out by the same tactics Maggie was now using on me. It wasn't just my fight anymore. It was everyone's. Still, the harassment grew louder. HOA patrols in matching polo shirts parked at the edge of my property, jotting down license plates. Anonymous letters stuffed in my mailbox warned me to think about the children. At night, I'd hear whispers across the fence line. The laughter of men who thought intimidation was victory, but Pops's journal sat open on my kitchen table. His words, written in fading ink decades ago, reminded me, "Water is for everyone. Guard it well." Maggie had her mob. But now, I had allies, and that changed everything. War teaches you one thing above all. You don't go into battle without a plan. Maggie thought she was burying me under ordinances and smear campaigns, but all she was doing was giving me time to prepare. I spread maps across my kitchen table, the edges curling under the weight of old coffee mugs. My drone circled overhead each morning, snapping images of the development's fragile skeleton 5 homes planted directly in the old creek bed. 3 more with basements sunk below seasonal high water marks. They weren't homes. There were mistakes waiting for gravity and rainfall to correct. Next came the math. Flow rates, soil absorption, rainfall. Average as I calculated it all with the precision the Army had drilled into me. Pops's dam wasn't just a pond in the pasture. It was a carefully designed flood control system built to redirect 2.8 million gallons safely downstream. And thanks to a month of steady rain, it was holding 3.1. But the true revelation came one moonlit night as I inspected the dam's old concrete spillway. Buried beneath weeds and thyme was a set of hydraulic gates I hadn't seen since I was a boy. Pops had built them as part of an emergency release system. The steel was rusted, the bolts stiff, but when I tested the mechanism, water whispered through with a hollow echo. The system still worked. I wiped my hands on my jeans, heart pounding. Pops hadn't just built a dam. He'd built a weapon against greed, disguised as a gift for the community, and his journals confirmed it. Tucked between yellowed pages, I found an entry from 1980, "Opened spillway today. Helped the Santos farm and 3 others get through the dry spell." That's what neighbors do. The words hit me harder than any ambush overseas. This wasn't about revenge. It was about restoration. Maggie wanted to turn the creek into a private water feature for her suburban empire. Pops had built it to keep families alive, so I turned my preparation into a military operation. I installed water flow meters at 3 points: dam outlet, creek diversion, and downstream farm. I documented every fluctuation with time-stamped video. I rebuilt the hydraulic controls, greasing bolts until they turned smooth under my hands. This wouldn't be some reckless flood. It would be precise, controlled, and undeniable. A demonstration of how water was meant to flow and how far Maggie had twisted nature to suit her greed. Every calculation, every bolt tightened, every drone flight brought me closer to the moment. The storm clouds building on the horizon weren't just weather. They were cover. They were destiny. I whispered to Pops's journal as I closed it for the night. You built it to save them. I'll use it to save us all. The night before the storm broke, I barely slept. Trail cameras had caught men in tactical vests, creeping around the dam, trying to jam concrete into the spillway. Their plan was simple: sabotage the gates so any release would look catastrophic. But Deputy Rodriguez was waiting in the dark. The arrests were quiet. The message was loud: Maggie was willing to risk lives to protect her empire. At dawn, sky blazed orange, storm clouds stacked high on the horizon. I stood at the dam controls, Pops's journal tucked in my pocket, while my allies gathered like sentinels: Miguel Santos, with decades of farming records; Mrs. Chen, with faded photos of her once green garden; Amanda Cross, the environmental lawyer; and Tony Riggs from the EPA. Badge on his chest, and just across the fence line, she had staged her own army, 20 HOA loyalists in folding chairs, "Protect Our Kids" signs waving, live streaming with trembling voices about the dangerous veteran threatening families. News crews circled like vultures. The entire town was watching. At 7:02 a.m., I wrapped my hands around the steel lever and pulled. The mechanism groaned, then gave. Water surged forward, not in a violent torrent, but in a steady, controlled flow that whispered like freedom returning home. Willow Creek filled its natural bed for the first time in 18 months. The diverted channels Maggie had carved turned useless. Her decorative ponds reduced to mud. Miguel knelt by the rushing current, scooping water in his weathered hands, tears streaking through the dust on his face. This is my grandfather's farm again," he whispered. Mrs. Chen clutched my arm, her eyes shining as her garden irrigation pipes filled for the first time in over a year. Maggie screamed across the water, voice cracking as her phone streamed live. "He's flooding our children's homes. Arrest him. This is terrorism." But the cameras told a different story. Reporters zoomed in on the creek bed water flowing exactly where it always had. Homes untouched, fences standing, families safe. EPA agent Kim announced calmly into her mic, "This is a lawful restoration of natural water flow." Maggie's narrative collapsed in real time. Her supporters started folding up their chairs, walking away. The truth was visible, undeniable, stoppable just like the water. And as the current sparkled under the morning sun, I knew Pops's dam had done its job one more time. The courthouse smelled of stale coffee and polished wood, but the air was electric. Every seat was filled, farmers with weathered hands, HOA loyalists clutching signs, reporters with cameras poised like rifles. This wasn't just a hearing. It was a reckoning. Maggie swept in first, pearls glinting under the lights, her lawyers in tow like armored knights. Rick followed, jaw clenched, papers tucked under his arm. They still believed their empire could be defended with theatrics and lies. Their attorney thundered about flood damage and an unstable veteran weaponizing water. They wheeled in an expert psychiatrist who had never met me, but diagnosed combat-fueled. Revenge fantasies from newspaper clippings. The gallery gasped. For a moment, it felt like the tide was turning their way. Then Amanda Cross stood, calm, precise. She laid out Pops's 1978 covenant requiring seasonal flooding, handed the judge EPA reports confirming the spillway restored natural flow, and projected photos of Miguel's cracked fields now green with life. Agent Kim from the EPA testified firmly. This was not sabotage. This was lawful water management. Rick squirmed under questioning. Amanda asked about zoning changes pushed through while I was deployed. His voice cracked. Then she played a recording of him screaming into the phone that Psycho is destroying millions in property value. The courtroom erupted, and then came the moment that silenced everyone. Amanda placed Pops' handwritten journal on the stand. I read aloud his words from 1980. Open spillway today. Help 3 farms survive the drought. That's what neighbors do. The judge leaned back, eyes heavy with the weight of truth. This court will not obstruct lawful federal enforcement. The spillway operation was legal. HOA is ordered to cease interference immediately. Cheers thundered through the room. Maggie's face drained of color. Rick stormed out, and the gavel fell like thunder. The battle for the land was over. 6 months later, Willow Creek flowed free again. What had started as one man standing against an HOA became a wave of justice that washed away years of corruption. Rick Thornwell pled guilty to federal conspiracy charges. 3 years in prison, stripped of his city council seat, his construction company barred from federal contracts. Maggie fared even worse. Civil penalties stacked higher than her designer heels, over $8 million. She filed for bankruptcy, her BMW repossessed, her empire dissolved. The Willowbrook HOA. Gone, dissolved like sugar in rainwater, but while their empire crumbled, ours blossomed. The land value surged. Not because of McMansions, but because the creek was designated a federal conservation trust. Eco-tourists came to kayak, birdwatch, and fish in waters where the Guadalupe bass had returned in record numbers. Families who once feared drought now had their fields watered again. Miguel's cattle drank from full troughs. Mrs. Chen's garden flourished, her vegetables once more feeding the farmer's market and the community that had been divided by. Lies was now united by water. Every spring we host the Creek Days Festival. Neighbors gather with food, music, and laughter, celebrating not just the return of a stream, but the strength of a town that chose truth over tyranny. The diner walls are covered with photographs, children splashing in the creek, farmers holding up their harvests, Pops' old cowboy hat framed above the counter. I used the settlement money to buy back Miguel's farm at tax auction, then handed it back to him debt-free. He cried, tried to refuse, but I reminded him of Pops' words. That's what neighbors do. Together, we started a scholarship in Pops' name for students studying water management. The first recipient. Miguel's daughter, Maria. She's headed to UT Austin to become an environmental engineer. Sarah moved back from California. 8. We rebuilt the farmhouse using sustainable methods. Solar panels glinting on the roof, the front porch restored instead of condemned. On Sundays, she helps me tend the land, and sometimes we just sit with coffee, listening to the creek sing like it used to when Pops checked it after heavy rains. As for me, I found something I hadn't realized I'd lost. Peace. After years of war abroad and battles at home, finally understood what Pops had been teaching all along. The land isn't just dirt and water. It's memory. It's legacy. It's community. Maggie once screamed at me across that creek, "You've destroyed everything." But she was wrong. I didn't destroy, restored. Her homes may have fallen, her lies may have drowned, but Pops' vision, it flows stronger than ever. Now, when I stand at the dam, hand resting on the lever Pops once showed me, I don't think about revenge. I think about stewardship. About making sure no one ever steals from this land again. About neighbors protecting neighbors, water shared instead of hoarded, truth flowing as naturally as the creek itself. And I think about the fight ahead, because there will always be another Maggie, another Rick, another greedy hand, reaching for what isn't theirs. But there will also always be people like oos farmers, veterans, families, communities ready to stand guard. So if you're out there fighting your own HOA nightmare, your own battle against corruption or greed, don't give up. Document everything. Find your allies. And remember, the law is stronger than their lies when you fight for what's right. Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one. Because these fights are easier when we fight together. Water finds a way. Justice finds a way. And when a community stands together, no dam of lies can hold back the truth.